First of all, I just want to say thank you very much for coming out on this bright and beautiful Sunday morning. It's great to see such a big, enthusiastic crowd, and I'm guessing a lot of you in the room right now are fans of murder mysteries and mystery fiction, which I am as well, and I'm sure Nayana is too, so that's always lovely to see. I'm Ausma, and I'm pretty sure that very quickly you're going to pick up on my Canadian accent, so I'm going to put that right out there. I'm Canadian, transplanted to the United States. I've been here now for about 10 years, 7 years in Denver, and I have a sort of peripatetic background. I've moved 26 times, I've lived in 4 different countries, and I consider myself, I was born in England, my parents are from Pakistan, but they were born in India. And then I was mostly raised in Canada with 10 years in the US. So I have all these different things that I bring into my life, and and because I'm a writer, I'm able to go around different places and transport my career fairly easily. But my background is actually in law, and I used to practice immigration law, and I studied for a long time international human rights law, which is my real passion. And it's something that you will also see in my book, my debut novel, The Unquiet Dead. And so that's really where my passion and my focus lies. I mean, I love mysteries, and I've been reading them all my life. So I thought that this genre was one that I could actually write in as well. And I've tried to bring all those things, the migration, the fluid identity, the travel, the human rights, into this one particular story with my love of mystery fiction. And having said that, I'm now going to turn it over to Nayana so she can introduce herself and her wonderful book.
Thank you. We decided to introduce ourselves instead of each other, although we were nervous about it. But it was kind of odd because we don't have a moderator, so we thought, well, So here I'm Nayana Currimbhoy. My novel, Mrs Timmins School for Girls, is set in a boarding school in the 70s in a remote mountain in India. And the boarding school is run by British missionaries, and the little Indian girls are eating porridge and doing Scottish dancing in kilts, actually. So that is the sort of platter of the novel. I live in New York City with my family, and that's about it. So, I mean, in the sense of what I can say about myself. I wanted to actually start with questioning the way we are. It says the discreet charm of the Whodunit. And I want to know, why is it discreet? It's really not. I mean, I don't think either my book is discreet. It's about this young girl coming of age in India in the 70s, and it's about all the influences that are there at that time, and she goes on to have this sort of lesbian affair, and then another affair, and there's sort of drugs, and there's rock and roll. And so in some ways, I think discreet means, in some ways, crime fiction is not looked on as serious fiction or literary fiction. And perhaps it's not, because you have to stick, I suppose you have to stay within the genre. But the point is there has to be suspense. So you have to cast aspersions on everybody. So it seems you cannot develop a character more deeply. That was what it was when you have the British classic English mystery, or you have the hard-boiled sort of American mystery, where you have these sort of very silent detectives who say very little, and then you're supposed to think about it. And so no character is examined very closely. However, I mean, there are new writers now like Gillian Flynn or Tana French who do go into character and place. And I think that we are both hoping that we've done the same. I mean, not to that level, but we're trying to say something more in our books. Just, we're trying to portray a time, a place, an event. And we'll go into that further. So I will actually start with a question for Ausma, where she has chosen a murder mystery to really talk about things that she wanted to say about human rights violations in the Balkans, specifically in Srebrenica. So why did you choose a murder mystery as a vehicle?
I think one of the reasons that I chose the form, as I mentioned before, it's a form that I love to read. It's a form I'm really comfortable with. But the deeper reason behind it is because I've been trying to write about the war in Bosnia for a very long time. And I had approached it from a number of different perspectives. I had written songs, I had written a play, but I had never felt that I could fully capture the things that I was exposed to, or the things that I had learned during the war. And I was looking for, I mean, it's been 20 years now since the war, but I had just started law school when it started, and what I was studying, international law, suddenly became very real and immediate. And I think I needed, after 12 years of graduate studies, I needed some time to process all those things. But I kept hearing those voices constantly from the war and thinking that, well, you have to write about it, but I don't know how to approach it. I don't know how to give it an authentic story. When enough time had passed, I realized that my entry point had to be from a distance. So what I chose to do was insert this Canadian detective with a special unit called the Community Policing Section, which is specially tasked with investigating minority-sensitive cases. So we have a story where a man has gone for a walk along the cliffs and apparently just fallen to his death. So why is this special investigation unit asked to look into Christopher Drayton's death? On the surface, it doesn't seem like anything that would relate to them. But then as you unpack the story a little bit and you find out that, I'm not giving anything away, it's on the inside cover of the book jacket, you find out that he might have been a Bosnian Serb war criminal who had found refuge in Canada. So the way for me to approach that story and to tell it with distance and a little bit of objectivity was to make my detective a Canadian Muslim who might have a kind of connection to the victims of the war. And that made it a little easier for me to process the information and the emotion associated with it. And also because so often when you're writing a story like that about a genocide, about horrific human rights abuses, about the darkness in the human heart, it can also overwhelm your readers if it's too much, too fast, too many facts. So I thought this was a way of adding those elements of suspense, introducing all the subplots, deepening the characterization, without losing the heart of that story.
And you do that really well. Now, I'm sorry, I'm not going to look directly at Ausma all the time because the light is in my face. So don't think it's because I don't want to see her. It's just so one of the things that you have is you have Kathak, your main detective, who's a deeply religious man. He's a Muslim man. And you start the whole novel with him in prayer. Now, I want to know how hard was it to sell this, to publish a novel with a Muslim detective who is deeply religious and goes back to his religion every so often to find peace and solace?
That's a great question. I don't think it was that hard to sell because I had this very fortuitous story where my manuscript was entered into a contest and it came across the desk of an editor who just fell in love with the story and was really passionate and fought for it so that I didn't have to fight for it. But I certainly acknowledge what's behind your question is this idea that we don't often see Muslim characters in fiction portrayed in sensitive and humane ways who are actually connected to their faith and who might feel informed in their lives by their faith. So I know that's something very rare, and that's one of the reasons that I wanted to introduce this particular character and have him have this connection to the mystery. Because I felt that when you're talking about Muslim identity, which is such a central theme of this book, it's always a question of being spoken about, spoken for, spoken to, represented, misrepresented, but rarely adding your own voice to that conversation or your own perspective. And the second book in this series, it's the same pair of detectives, but it's about the mystery revolves around a murder tied to a terrorism plot. And one of the things my editor immediately said to me was, do we really need another book about Muslims and terrorism? And my answer to that had been, well, you might like to see this story from the perspective of a Muslim character, because I don't think you see that very often.
And he's also the detective, so he's also the solver of the crime.
He's the solver, and he has an insight that maybe others wouldn't have.
Yes.
Now let me ask you a question in turn. So my question has to do with, when I read your book, one of the things, and this book is this amazing, rollicking, romantic, fascinating read, but for me, what really stuck out in your story is the sense of place where you've situated your story. I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly, in Panchgani.
Correct.
Which is, it's so atmospheric and so richly detailed, and it's like the central character in the book. And I sort of wanted to turn your question back on you, that when I read the first volume of your book, which is book 1, I'm not even paying attention to the mystery. I'm so completely fascinated by the setting and the characters. So why did you choose to use this form to tell this story that to me seems so intimate and personal?
Well, it is. I mean, the platter is one I know because I went to a boarding school which is in Panchgani itself, and very similar. So it wasn't a leap of imagination. In a way, I was actually writing what I knew. But place is really important to me in my novels, and in a way what I've tried to say beyond the rollicking murder mystery is a time and a place. It's so you use a small place to spiral out. So you say this is the story of one conventional girl caught up in her time and where there were influence of colonialism. There's old Indian sort of family structures that she must fight, and then there is the sort of culture of the hippies. You know, there's sort of so many different things, but we are still in India in a small place. And so I was trying to use this to spiral out into what a snapshot of a country at that time. Have I answered it?
You have, but I have a follow-up question related to that. So one of the things that I found coming from a very conservative Pakistani culture, my family is Pashtuns from the north, so that sort of infiltrated my own identity, and I know the stories of my mother, grandmother, aunts, and all of that. And one of the things that I was really stunned by was I always picture that part of the world as so conservative. And here we have this, you know, the hippies, the drugs, the LSD, all the different types of marijuana that you can get there, and all the young men that this conservative girl is able to hang out with and party with and still keep her reputation intact. And I guess I really wanted to know how realistic and how representative of it is it of that real period?
Well, in some ways, I think that my heroine is also, she has a disfiguration. She has a blot on her face. She's from a very conservative background, but when she first comes here, she's kind of stunned by it's so different. But she always had this sort of fear: is where is my place in this society? How I will never get married. Nobody's going to marry me, or I'll have to find somebody. In one thing, in a later stage, I say in a sort of patriarchal society, there is a catalogue of disfigurement, so that the woman is always less disfigured than the man. Like if you have a blot, you better marry somebody with like a club foot, or if you have bad teeth. So in a sort of form of an arranged marriage, she would still be within caste but not within class, and she would probably be stuck with maybe a divorcee with 2 children or something. So she is a thinking girl, and she finds no place for herself in the society that she is supposed to, you know, the dictates of her society. So when she suddenly finds herself in this situation where she can do other things and nobody's really watching, so she starts step by step, and at each step she's kind of upset, sort of not sure what she's doing, and she keeps following her heart until she becomes whatever we call liberated or not. I mean, you know, so it is it is also the story of her liberation.
Interesting.
And she had less to lose, I feel. She had nothing to lose.
Did she have anything to gain?
If you have nothing to lose, you might as well. You'll find out as you go, right?
Without giving anything away about your book, I wondered if you could just comment on, is the ending of the book a definitive ending? Because at the end, I still couldn't be sure what had happened.
Yeah, that is true. And in fact, I remember at the Jaipur Literary Festival, this young person ran up to me very worried, and she said, "Should I be worrying about Charu?" So I thought, you know what, don't worry, it's over. But yes, it is true, but I don't know what to say unless I give it away.
I guess you can simply say it's ambiguous then.
Yeah. Okay. All right. I will say that. But it's not that bad. I mean, in the sense, it's not like you feel, why did I read this whole thing now? I don't even know. It's not. So now you had your 3 questions. Okay. Now mine. So, one thing I was so stunned by how you do set this whole thing in a very placid Canadian landscape. It's beautiful. There are lovely houses. There's a museum. But when you earlier said that these voices were in your head, you start, and I'm going to read this because she doesn't want to read from her book, but you start with every chapter with these little sayings from the war that brings you back, that tells you, look, it's much worse than it is here, and there's another world out there which is so terrible you do not know. So she starts, for example, chapter 5, which says, I took my mother's head into my hands and I kissed her. I never felt anything so cold before. And then, that's in italics, that's from somewhere, and then she just says, in the car, he didn't wait for Rachel. So you really use this to jump in time and space and create this kind of unquietness of the Unquiet Dead right there. How did you do that, or something?
So what you're referring to is at the beginning of every chapter of the book, there are little quotations that start the chapter, and I use them to frame the subject matter, both of the chapter, but also because I used to be sitting alone in this little small human rights library in Ottawa, the capital of Canada, and I would be the only person there with all this material that would be coming in every day or every other day, statements before the Security Council that had been made by representatives of the Bosnian government, or testimony, or later on as the war would progress and the International Criminal Tribunal had been set up, war crimes testimony. I would be in the community doing student and community activism, meeting with refugees and hearing their stories. And so those voices, I thought, and in the 20 years that have elapsed since then, you hardly see them, you hardly hear them, but they were always with me. And even as I would be reading them, a statement such as, "On Tuesday there will be no bread in Sarajevo," I would think, this is such a powerful and lyrical statement, and it deserves to be heard I guess on a much wider basis, or on a bigger platform. And I don't know how big my platform is, but because I felt they were so strong and so powerful and so poetic, I wanted to really ground my book in Bosnian voices, since the Bosnian characters don't have a chance to speak very much.
Yeah.
So that's kind of what I was aiming for there.
And it's very successful. I mean, it's extremely successful because it just really stays with you, and it contrasts so well with your two characters. So she has Kathak, and then she has the foil, who's Rachel, a very sort of hockey-playing, tracksuit wearing person whose job it is in some ways to kind of translate Kathak, who is very debonair and dapper and kind of deep. And she's a little in love with him, I'm thinking. But
that's what a lot of my readers think.
And you don't.
Well, my editor says you have to bring them together at some point, so
but not yet.
I'm
right?
going to leave that up in the air.
All right. So.
Well, yes, the two detectives are definitely meant to be foils to each other.
And it's part of a series which you're going into. You're already writing 3 other books, right?
That's right, yes. So I'm very lucky, very blessed. I have a book coming out in February, and then 2 more in this series with these 2 detectives, because I feel that the 2 of them still have a lot of growing to do, both together and apart, and a lot of interesting crimes that I want them to solve. But the crimes would always have, I guess, you know how you read a series in mysteries. You could read a World War I series, or you could read a medieval priest series, and it's still a mystery. So my angle, I think, is it's always related to some kind of human rights issue somewhere around the world. So the second is a terrorist plot, but then the third is related to human rights in Iran, and so on and so forth, as long as there's any appetite for people to read about those things. So it'll allow the detectives to play off each other, and I think that's a really insightful thing that you said, that Rachel is an interpreter, essentially, of Khadak. But they are, in their own ways, each very Canadian. And as you mentioned with the hockey playing, well, hockey, of course, to Canada is like football here. It's its own religion. And so for me, that was a big part of grounding her in her reality, but also him not being unfamiliar with that reality. He's Canadian-born, Canadian-raised. And I guess it allows you to explore things, but also leave some things unexplored that you want to bring out in later books, which is one of the things I love about a series, is that if you found characters that you like, you don't actually have to finish with them. You can hold on to them for a minute. Can I have a turn? All right, great. I think I had
It's your mic.
I had a question here. Oh, yes. So you said in one of your interviews that I read that the character that you most identified with the interviewer had asked you, who do you relate to in your books? And you said it was the trio of schoolgirls, who are these enchanting characters full of mischief and have elaborated this entire system of defying all the very rigid rules of their boarding school. And they are utterly captivating. In some ways, they're completely mystifying things that they're willing to try and the things they're willing to risk. But I always felt that the heart of your book is Charu, and she spoke so powerfully, particularly in book 1 and book 3 of your book. So I was just wondering why you felt that that was more you.
I thought that the 3 schoolgirls, even in their mischievous way, are the grounding of, whereas Charu is an unreliable narrator in a way, because of her blood, because of her own insecurities, she sees, she's looking at everybody looking at her, but she sees she's seeing it behind a mask. She thinks nobody really gets to her, and so she sometimes sees things much bigger than they are, or she misses clues. So she cannot be the detective. So she really is an unreliable narrator, although she relates 2 of the 3 books. So in some ways, the girls, with all their kind of strange mischief and their immaturity, whatever, are the true kind of center of the book, in that they kind of show you the world as it was. And I guess why did I say I related more to them? I probably said that because I thought my daughter would be reading. But she hasn't. So, yeah.
So I don't have kids, but I have 12 nephews and nieces, and when the book came out, they all wanted to read it, and of course I said, they're all under the age of 18, I said, absolutely not, give it 10, 15 years, I don't want to scar anybody's young psyche with what's covered in this book. So I kind of understand what you're saying here.
Charu is doing everything that I may not want my daughter to do. So.
And tell me, is the book meant to interpret the British presence in India in any way?
It's part of it, yes, because the 70s were the end of the colonial, there were still people staying, it's less and less, but this was still only, let's say, 30 years after partition, so there were still all these sort of boarding schools run by British missionaries who really imposed their culture without a thought. We were not allowed to speak in our native languages. There was no Indian classical dance. In a point, Charu, not understanding the differences, says, she wants to be helpful. She says, well, I can teach Indian classical dance. And, the missionary says, she blushes and then she says, well, that may not be that appropriate. And why, we don't know, because we are, so that is what they took for granted. It was the white man's burden, it was these people had to educate these young Indian minds and all this. So their culture took, so that was one aspect of it for sure. That although they, it may have been receding, but we didn't know it. At that time, it was very much felt within that school. There was Bible studies, and there was, there was just like, it was run really like a boarding school from the missionaries' time. It was sort of run like their schools had been run. We had, there were inspections where you had to kneel and your dress had to be whatever, 6 inches or something probably. And meanwhile, we're talking about the time of mini dresses and, so, yeah, that was part of it.
Do you want to read something from your book that relates to a little bit of this? You told me you picked out a few places that were interesting.
Okay, all right. So what I'm going to read is about the town. She spoke about Panchgani, the little town that is, the book is set in, being kind of a character too. So I will read what I say about that right in the beginning. So I say 1974 was the year of the great Panchgani scandals. Panchgani is not on the way to anywhere at all. It is a small town on a medium mountain reached only by one long and winding road. In the summer, families come from the cities and the plains. Children lurch through the bazaar on undernourished ponies. Honeymoon couples climb up to Sydney Point to watch the sunset. But the monsoon settles long and hard in this region of the mountains. Nobody comes to Panchgani in the monsoons, except perhaps sturdy parents of small children. The retirees, the TB patients, the hotel owners close their homes and their businesses and go off to live with their daughters in Pune. No one leaves Panchgani in the monsoons. The steep mountain slopes are slippery, and you can see trucks overturned in the valleys. The rain closes in around the town, and those who remain consider themselves the real people of Panchgani. So my novel is set in the monsoons, of course. So where it's only the schoolgirls, and it's always misty. It gets the mountain next to Panchgani gets the second highest rainfall in the world. So we're kind of on the leeward side, but not really. It's always misty. It's always ready for suspense. So
it does. It creates that atmosphere of them being trapped. And here you have this murderer run amok.
Yes.
And you have to solve it without a lot of help, and you're not really sure where the police stand.
Right.
So you have to be very independent, and it does create that atmosphere of fear and dread all the way through the book, very successfully.
Thank you. So now are you going to read?
I didn't actually prepare anything to read.
All right. So then I have another question for you. So when you, how are you going to keep this romance at bay? Because she is really in love with him. I'm beginning to feel sorry for her.
Are you? I'm not sure that
And he's not looking at her.
He's not. You're right. Yes, my
Clutches at straws, right? She's saying, somebody says, oh, he thinks very highly of you, and she's like, oh my God, really?
Right. Yeah. Well, I know that with the mysteries that I like to read, I always like it when it's a male and female detective. I always like when there's a little bit of romantic tension. So I thought, if that's intriguing to me, I hope it could also be intriguing to my readers. But as I've been writing in the series, and I'm trying to develop Rachel as a person who stands on her own, she's about a decade younger than Isa. I'm actually finding her grow and move out and gain her own confidence and perhaps not need so much validation from him. And
so it could go either way.
It could go either way. And in the first book, The Unquiet Dead, I've introduced this character named Nathan Clare.
Yes.
And I'm kind of having him keep an eye on Rachel and seeing what I might do down the road there as well. So a little bit of romantic suspense, but I myself don't know yet what's happening with these characters.
So what you know, when you said that she's developing, growing, that brings me to another kind of some point in story writing is that I think that you can divide the two kinds of authors. One who, like Nabokov said, his characters are galley slaves. They do what he says. And Donna Tartt said the same thing. But for me, I find that my characters start walking and growing, and there's certain things they will not do, and there's certain things they do. So they kind of seem to grow on in your mind as you start writing them. And do you find the same?
Absolutely.
Yes,
because
they're not galley slaves.
I had a complete plan for exactly how Issa was going to be and exactly how Rachel was going to be. And then as I would write, I couldn't make those scenes seem real because the characters kept wanting to do other things. So I thought Issa would be very, very sophisticated, but also very remote and brooding. But he actually, as you get to know him, he has a lot of flaws and he has a lot of emotional uncertainty. And he's not so confident and irresistible. He is very irresistible in many cases. And in Rachel's case, I thought she might be a bit more gauche and not really know what she's up to or what she wants from life. But when it comes to anything important, Rachel was like, I'm not so wimpy. I can speak up for myself. I'm going to do what I want to do, and you might not like it, and I'm going to take risks. So it wasn't what I had planned. I think I had planned something much more traditional and conservative, and it just, they wanted to do what they wanted to do.
Yeah, so it is mysterious how they sort of pick up and start kind of becoming characters and all. And thank God for that, I say, because you know it takes the story in ways that you didn't plan.
And it's a nice spark.
Yes.
And it keeps things going, I think.
Yeah.
And which character in your book do you feel is most unlike what you had planned for?
That's a good question. I think Charu herself, actually, because I didn't really plan for her to open out quite that much, or you know, start taking so much control of her own narrative. I was seeing her as a mule in a way, as a carrier of the story, but she really took over, and so that was one of them. Murch too. I mean, her foil is Murch, and well, no, actually, Murch behaved more or less. I take that back. Yeah.
Okay. All right. What I was thinking when I was reading those characters is, first, I really did think that Charu was just a mule or a slave to Pin, the female character that she has a love affair with. But then as I get into book 2 and book 3, I can see that she's becoming more and more powerful. Even how she negotiates buying all her drugs and deciding what drugs she's going to take. That just completely overwhelmed me.
Oh my God, I don't remember that.
And I would be, this is amazing coming from what I had so falsely imagined to be such a closed world and such a circumspect world. So I think that's one of the things that really caught my imagination.
That's in a way why I wanted to write the book, because I always felt that a lot of novels about India have kind of like this sort of heavy spiritual overlay, or this sort of jasmine-scented prose. And I wanted to show that there was another side. It may have been just a little crust of it, but it's a small place at a small time and at a big time. You know, the 70s, which brought so many different ways of thinking too. And that's what I wanted to do this book for, because I wanted to show them other worlds.
Right.
And I chose the murder mystery as a scaffolding in a way, because it was my first novel, and I didn't really know how I would carry it through if I was just writing about the place and the time. So I thought, well, at least if I sort of put a scaffolding on it, my characters will have to move within that genre. But I have to say I was irritated by that genre at times, because it kind of...
You felt confined a little bit. That you have to provide clues, you have to provide suspects.
Right.
They have to track
everybody
through
has to be a
timelines.
Suspect, yes.
Right, I know, that is the complicated part.
That is the complicated.
I would make these elaborate charts because I would sometimes forget where I had put somebody or what they had said, and who was responsible for discovering what, and at the end I'd be like, oh no, that doesn't make any sense, 10 readers are going to catch that right
It was
away.
the end that was the hardest, to bring all the clues back in. And I don't know how much I succeeded.
I think you succeeded very well. So I hope people will pick up this book because it's completely immersive and fascinating. When I asked you to describe it to me when we were talking before the panel, you had said this is just a lighthearted kind of book, and it's not meant to be more than this snapshot. But when I read it, I felt, I always have this, used to spend my childhood summers in Pakistan, and I felt immediately a really much deeper sense of connection to place and history and identity. So I think, despite how you described it as being lighthearted maybe in tone, that it's actually very deep in its themes. And
That's
how
why I'm going to take you with me.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Do we have questions? I mean, I think we're sort of done.
Well, one of us will hand you a microphone, please, so everyone can hear.
On Bosnia, I have two friends. One that looked into it as a military person, that looked into all the burials, the big burials. The other best friend, owned a farm and a business in Tuzla and went through the war. I couldn't find much to read about what happened to him. Just all the forensic books. The ladies would come back and they would write on, I was a forensic person, and they would have they all knew each other. And so all the books tend to take on the sameness. But I had lived in the Balkans, and I still couldn't find anything. I couldn't find anything there, couldn't find anything here. Besides the reports, where did you find something?
Well, because I had done my PhD dissertation on the war in Bosnia, so I had access, apart from the reports, to I think at least 100 books on the war. But if you mean books told from the Bosnian side, Bosnian survivors, Bosnian witnesses, they're extremely hard to find. There are, I think, 2 now, both translated, and one is specifically about someone who had lived through the entire siege of Srebrenica, one of the enclaves on the eastern border, and there's a much smaller, I think, more poetic volume as well. But you're right, that material is very hard to find. And even now, 20 years later, after the book has come out, I'm meeting a lot of Bosnians for the first time. And this is one of the questions I've been asking as well about recording history and testimony. And what I'm learning is it's too soon for a lot of people to even have understood the trauma that they've experienced, let alone communicate it in some much more public way, even though I'm always pushing for that because I think it's important that those voices not be lost.
It was really hard for not the military so much, because it was after the fact and you knew what was going to happen, but she was raising 2 children that had been kidnapped and kept to keep her in Bosnia. And I mean, we're very close. We're always hugging, and she's always in my pocket all the time. And she could not tell the tales until last year.
Yeah, that doesn't surprise me at all.
Anirudh, there's a person up there that's also asking. You can go next.
Very nice discussion. I wanted to compliment you. A novel or any book, in some sense, is a mirror of the times which the author is describing. And so both of you, for example, Bosnia and the Indian mountain station, a so different scenario. Do you feel responsible that you have to portray the correct version or your own image? Because this book may become a document of history 50 years from now.
Well, I mean, I can't remember.
One more thing.
Sorry.
What you described about India, I mean, I've not been to that particular mountain town, but isn't it very typical of a class of society in India, not general?
No, you're right. Absolutely not. It's a certain kind of, I guess, city people who have access. So yes, it's not typical. But then I think that when you said the responsibility, I think that somebody said that novels are a secret history. Which author, I can't suddenly remember, some great author, of course, said that novels are a secret history. So it's like a small history of a time and a place. And I guess one should feel responsible, but I think fiction can, the beauty of fiction is that you can just say that it's fiction.
or also your interpretation
Yeah,
of the
yeah,
period
right,
and the
right,
time.
right. You also,
In my book, for certain, I absolutely knew I had to, because one of the outcomes of the war has been a period of genocide denial as well.
Yes.
So I knew my book, at least in terms of the facts on the ground of the war, had to be 100% accurate. But there, of course, from that point with my own
no,
characters.
but you had that responsibility.
I had that responsibility
Yes.
to get that right, but my own characters were able to interpret events as they wished.
Yes, I'd like to ask about influences on your work. And Nayana, I think you said that it's a girls' school and they were dancing in kilts, and the first thing that came to my mind is Muriel Sparks'
Yes.
The Crime of Miss
Miss
Jean
Jean
Brodie,
Brodie,
which
yes.
is a great novel and also a fine film, actually. And also Picnic at Hanging Rock, and there are
Yes.
lots of
Yes, there are lots of boarding schools.
Exactly.
Hot house. Yeah.
Exactly. And the same for you. I was thinking, I don't know, is it Le Carré and the spy who came in from the cold, or so my question is just what have you been reading, and what influenced your work, either in subject matter or style or whatever?
Oh no. I was going to interrupt you.
For me, I started with a lot of classic British children's fiction. So from a young age, all these girls' school stories like Mallory Towers, Enid Blyton, and then the famous Five, The Secret Seven, and all of those books, Agatha Christie, then up through a whole other slew of character-driven and historical period mysteries. So that was a big part of my mystery writing education, but definitely my greatest influence has been the Golden Age Queen Ngaio Marsh, who's such a fantastic stylist of language. I love all her books, and I've read them over and over again all my life. But in addition to that, because I've spent my life in all these interesting and strange places, I'd been in the West Bank for quite a while, and there I've been in their library in Birzeit every day reading Arabic literature in translation. And I had a huge influence at one point of Arabic writers and Arab poets that I could only access in translation, or Pakistani poets who the Urdu would be a little bit too sophisticated for me, so I would be reading all of that in translation, or Persian poetry that my parents would constantly recite to me. So I think that always impressed upon me the idea of lyricism in writing. And so those things together were a big influence, but my favorite writer of all time, who I think is an absolute genius, is Amin Maalouf, the Lebanese French writer, whose books I've again read in translation, but they are just marvelous periods of history. And what he's able to do that I really admire is bring so many disparate themes together in a single book and articulate them all with a very light touch.
Are they available?
Those you can find, yes. You can order them from Amazon or anywhere else, any independent bookseller. Those are readily available. And the best in his collection is a book called Samarkand. I highly recommend that one. Samarkand. The Golden Road to Samarkand, the city, the Silk Road city, Samarkand. Now your turn.
So yeah, you mentioned Enid Blyton. So married, of course, I was in a boarding school reading Mallory Towers, which was set in a boarding school in England. So when it came to it, I thought this is kind of Mallory Towers spiked. And also twisted around because it's sort of skewed because it's in another culture altogether. It's this British culture being imposed, so it's Mallory Towers with these kind of different things. And having said that, I also think things like Donna Tartt, Secret History, which is again set in a very, school in in Vermont, and where everything is just very, it's a hot house, so you kind of develop that, yeah. And otherwise, I've been reading all my life, of course, so you don't know what infiltrates.
That's true, very true.
So a little more generally, you were saying that.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, sorry, the line's right. But navigating these trying to keep characters from being two-dimensional because the genre sometimes calls for that to keep them mysterious. But I also think that sometimes part of the charm of the genre is these strangely two-dimensional characters. That there's something sort of intriguing in that. So how did you navigate with taking these characters that generally have to be very flat and very, like, you can't dig too much in them, but also wanting to really modernize that and do a character study? I guess just speaking a little bit of that.
That's a very good question, actually, and it's. I think that the discipline demands that some characters for sure be kept two-dimensional. There is no way around that, because you have to have people absolutely suspect at least 4 people. So, so in some ways, some of them have to be kept at a little bit of a distance. Otherwise, you take the risk of them being cheated at the end. That you led us to believe that this was a pure character, but where did you even show us that this person was capable of murder? And at one point, I have these little schoolgirls saying, but that one doesn't feel like a murderer, and that one doesn't feel like a murderer. And then the third girl says, listen, who has ever met a murderer? You're talking about like as though we've had tea and toast with murderers all around. Nobody's met a murderer here, so let's just go with everybody.
It's a great answer, and I agree. There are some characters that and they're usually your suspects, that you don't explore too much because you want to leave the suspense there. Where I find the room is really in your investigating characters, or whoever's going to be communicating the story. That way you can go as deep as you want. And in my case, because I knew I was looking long-term down the road, I wanted to always leave possibilities open for not everything to come out in the first book. And then what I've noticed lately in mystery fiction that I've been reading, particularly with Elizabeth George, I don't know if you know her, she does that Thomas Lindley series. So she has a long-running series where we've been in these detectives' lives for, I think, 20 years or something. And so now what she's doing is additional characters, she deepens them, and their story becomes very deep and rich, and you're getting a lot of the narrative through these alternate perspectives. And I could see that that would be a narrative technique you'd need when you're 20 books into your series, because after that you've pretty much said everything and done everything. So it's a difficult tension, and it's a great question.
More questions? We have a bit more time. While you think of a question, I would like to point out that these books are available in the bookstore, and Nayana's book is called Miss Timmins School for Girls, which you should go buy right now, and then she can sign it.
I'm sorry, I won't be able to sign it because I have to rush to the canyon for another talk.
Well, you
but
can
I've
track
left
her
signed
down
copies.
sometime during the
I have
day.
left signed copies.
And Ausma's book is called The Unquiet Dead, and that's also over at the bookstore. So, yes. Hang on a second, we'll get you this. This will be the last question.
Can you hear me? Yeah. My favorite series are ones like the Inspector Eichmann series, where you really get a sense of place, in this case Turkey and especially Istanbul. And I'm always looking for those series, and since you said that you particularly wanted to give a strong sense of place, I wonder if you have series that you like that do that.
Yes, there is a writer that I discovered that probably a lot of you already know. I was in England last year, a writer named Peter May, whose mysteries, he writes several different series, but the one that I came across while I was there are set in the Hebrides. And it's such a great snapshot and capturing of a period, a culture, the faith of the people on the island, and their very unique and specific customs, but just absolutely gripping, heartbreaking. It's a super suspenseful mystery, so I love those. I love the Charles Todd series that's set in after the First World War. And that also has a really strong sense of atmosphere. And what I find very frustrating about those books, I think they're about 17 books in, is I'm dying to know more about this detective, but the authors always hold a little something in reserve. I want his life to move and progress. It never does. But he's still very intriguing for all of that. That gives you a lot of the battles of the First World War, and then the aftermath, which is something I'm interested in. I'm never just interested in what happened in the war, but what happens to the survivors? How do they rebuild afterwards? So those are two good series that I really love.